Welcome to the Hedgineer podcast with your hosts, Michael Watson and Jhanvi.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Hedgineer podcast. I'm your co-host, Michael Watson.
And I'm your other co-host, Jhanvi.
And today we're going to get into looping. It's been a pretty big topic. We've been using it a ton within Hedgineer and making it a little bit more digestible for everyone in the audience. Before we do that, Jhanvi, what's new? What's going on in the world of AI?
I feel like the thing that I've been seeing on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on like everything is Claude Tag, which is the new Slack integration that Anthropic just released, I would say like 2 days ago. And so obviously getting a lot of hype. Obviously, Slack is a very big part of a lot of companies. And more importantly, I think that there is so much really rich context about how a business works through analyzing their Slack. But I don't think that a lot of people appreciate the fact that Slack integrations for Claude existed before. Like, we've been using it for months within our team. I see it in our Slack channels all the time. So when I first saw this announcement, the first thing that I did was kind of look into how it was different than the existing one. And from my understanding, there's not a lot. And so I was mildly underwhelmed in comparison to the hype that it was receiving on the internet. But essentially, from my understanding, all it is it saves the context of all of the different Claude ats that you do in a specific channel. So over time, Claude gets a little bit better at understanding what this channel's for, what people are doing. You can also use like your MCP connectors within this. So you can you could add Claude within a channel, and you could actually have it pull data and do tasks, which earlier when you would add Claude in Slack, you would just get question answer.
Yeah.
Am I missing anything?
Well, I think there's a couple more things that I think are pretty interesting. One is that it actually has its own user. Like, I think with the new Claude tags integration, it actually has like a Claude entity that needs to be created that has its own permissions to tools, which I think is a pretty cool concept. I think most usage of Claude, it was running oftentimes as an individual user over MCP, where I would have to like go and authenticate. And then when I run Claude, it has like my authentication. I think this is where you're giving each channel its own entity and then its own permissions and shared state and context over time. So I think it's a more enterprise grade version of a Claude deployment. And it's been powerful for us. We have our own Claude integration that we've been using for a while, so we haven't switched over like fully to it, but
we also use the cursor integration a lot.
Yeah, the cursor integration is great.
It's really good.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why the Claude one didn't seem that interesting to me.
Yeah. I mean, I also love the linear integration, like being able to follow it back and forth with the user and do an @linear, create a ticket for this. And then you might have a Claude loop, which we can get into in a second, looking for new tickets that then goes and executes an implementation within a code base for it. And so you could start that with like a more of a general agent that is Claude or something else that goes and creates the linear ticket as part of the loop, opposed to starting with linear. But it's been obviously has a huge splash. And again, going back to them creating an entity specific for each channel, I think is pretty novel. Yeah. It gets a little bit to the thing that you were describing earlier, like on a side topic of Estonia allowing agents to have their own legal representation.
That I think is cool. That I think is very, very cool. The government of Estonia is putting a lot of time, resources, effort, energy into building an AI committee and an AI initiative suite that their government is kind of going after on the national level. And from my understanding, the main reasoning behind it is that the population of Estonia is not growing. And they see AI as an opportunity to boost overall GDP and national productivity to counterset the fact that the actual population is not growing, which I think is genius. Like, I think that's exactly what AI can do. And so their prime minister, I believe his name is Kristen Mikhail, has basically put together this council that's led by the CEO of Bolt, which is like a very popular ride-sharing company based in Europe. I didn't know that it was founded by an Estonian and it's headquartered in Estonia, but essentially it's chaired by the CEO of Bolt. And one of the things that they most recently made the news for last week was essentially greenlighting the ability to register AI agents with the government. and essentially associate them with your personhood so that you can give that agent the ability to do things on your behalf. And the rationale is every person in Estonia has like a digital ID, which from my understanding is very similar to like a social security number here. You use it to apply for a loan, to book doctor's appointments, to register for schools, like everything basically that has to do with the government. And the reasoning was that just giving that ID to an agent to have it do things on your behalf is potentially dangerous because that ID is associated with all of kind of the permissions and access and capabilities that you as a person have, which is really risky. So the idea is that these AI agents can have locked down agentic digital IDs that still have access to the things that you would potentially delegate out to. Like, let's say, I don't know, booking a doctor's appointment is a perfect example, but it wouldn't have the ability to, let's say, like apply for a loan, right? And when the prime minister announced this, he basically was like, AI is not going anywhere. Agents are going to be doing a lot of the work that we're doing on a day-to-day basis. Like, we are trying to be ahead of the curve and be a lot more thoughtful in how that actually manifests within how people interact with the government, which is really interesting. And this is just one of many other things. Like, they are implementing statewide education programs for AI training through their libraries. Like, they're training every librarian on AI so that you can go to your local library and take classes on how to use AI and how to get better at it. They're subsidizing like company hackathons that are focused on helping people learn how to build with AI. And so, yeah, that I think was one of the most interesting things I've read in terms of like what's new in AI in the past 2 weeks or so.
Yeah, Estonia has always been like a bit on the forefront because I know that they've had like a virtual residency for a while.
Yeah.
That was, if you're like a digital nomad, you can get a residency within Estonia. I don't know exactly what it gets you, but that was
popular during the pandemic, right?
Yeah, it was. It was.
I remember that.
Yeah. And so, but getting back to the identity that you can get, I think you almost need like an Entra ID for your Claude tag, and then you can get your own Estonian residency ID for your agent as well.
Yeah.
Having one language model, one frontier lab providing all of that capability for you does start to become dangerous from a vendor lock-in perspective. I forget where we were reading it because it resonated a ton with our business, but the risk of relying on Claude for inference is not that big of a deal because you can always go to another language model provider in terms of lock-in. When you relied on inference and the agentic harness like Claude Opus and then Claude Code, it's not that much of a vendor lock-in. The ergonomics are really nice with Claude Code or Claude Cowork, and the inference is really good. But if you want, you could go and use Codex with OpenAI. You could use OpenCode and continue to use Claude for inference, and it's not necessarily like that risky. But when you use it for the full suite of inference, agentic loop for the harness, and for having all of the context that you need in order to achieve tasks, then there's a bit of a risk that like, oh, well, if I'm using @Claude in Slack and it has all of the skills natively in Claude that I couldn't necessarily get out, as well as the memory and knowledge of what I've been doing previously with Claude, not just as me as a user, but across my entire organization, and it's the agentic harness, and it's the loop, then it starts becoming a bit of a lock-in, where if you're using Claude for everything within Slack and it starts learning about all the nuances of your business, like, oh, you have an issue with this macro when you're using it in Excel to do your end of month reporting, or when you're using it for your branding and style guide for your charts, you like it just like this, where you have like maybe like the punctuation in a specific italics. When you are doing your sales calls, you want to be able to prep in a certain way so you can touch on the most important parts of your business. Like, those are the things that you include in a prompt, or you include within like a Slack message that they remember and they can capture. And then they start trying to structure that for you, so it becomes magical. So like these skills are organized behind the scenes. The knowledge layer, the memory layer are all well organized, so that when you're in the agentic loop, and let's say Claude Code or within whatever's behind the scenes within Claude tags, that it has access to all of this knowledge. And it obviously has great inference. And then when you have one frontier provider doing all of that, it suddenly becomes really difficult when you go and say, oh, well, let me use something else. And that something else doesn't know anything about your business. You're always going to go back to it. And I think that risk of not owning your context, that is actually really important. So with something like Claude tags, if you have a bit of an over dependence on something like that for an extended period of time, you're essentially giving all of your data to, and all the knowledge about your nuanced workflows and things people are actually using for AI for an entire company over to a frontier lab that's going to be very effective. They can help you for a while. But what first feels like help will very soon transition to a dependency. And having a dependency on something that you can't control starts becoming risky. And so you can become dependent on AI to be competitive, but you don't want to be dependent on a single AI lab to be competitive. You want to be able to move across them and bring that context with you. So it's that third piece of the loop that I find most important in being able to be AI agnostic.
Yeah, I feel like with these frontier models, my appetite and excitement about new features used to be about how amazing the output was, like the magic, like you were saying. And now it's more about transparency. Like, and I don't think I'm the only person that thinks that way. I remember the day after Fable got shut down, I was listening to this AI podcast that had just come out, and the title was Fable is Gone, Here's What to Do Next. And the entire episode, it was this 35-minute episode that walked through step by step how to build your own model by like using an open source model and training it. And it was catered towards non-technical people because the sentiment is now around, okay, if you can take these things away from me, or you can jack up your prices and I can't get out because you own all of my context and I can't replicate this on my own. Like those are huge critical issues when running a business in this AI forward world. So with, for example, memory stores, which we were talking about a couple weeks ago, where Claude basically Anthropic came out with this new feature where you could start attaching these folders of text files of memory that Claude would constantly keep writing to. Like, I think that's fantastic because that memory store is mine, right? Like it's a bunch of text files that I can go in and read and I can download and I can save on a hard drive. With Claude Tag, you don't get that transparency. You don't actually understand when Claude is getting better at understanding your channel, why that is, and where that context is accessible. So if and when I use Claude Tag, I will be at the very end of my message, of every single message, be like, output everything that you've learned. So at the very least, that still sits in the channel. So if I ever wanted to export this data to somewhere else and build something similar, at least that context is with me. It's not going to be perfect, but it's like better than nothing.
Yeah. And one of the things I think one of the base things you need to do in order to own your own context, own your own data, is making sure that you have telemetry into all of your different AI usage. And so we as a firm, we have a lakehouse. Everything we use in AI flows into that lakehouse, whether it's Claude Code, whether it's Cursor, whether it's Codex, Open Code, GitHub, Copilot, and VS Code, Chat. It all flows into that lakehouse. Like I can't run a business that I'm thinking long-term about and sleep at night knowing that there's data that we should be organizing and structuring based off of our usage of AI that we're not capturing. And then we obviously offer that as one of the primary services for our clients, so they get to capture all of that as well. But with something like tags, I'm certain that open telemetry doesn't exist on that for day one. I don't know when they're going to roll that out, or even if they will, because if your users are able to use Claude through tags and not have full transparency into what the users are saying, and I'm sure they're going to have this, right? Like you'll likely be able to get this over Compliance API because it's a little bit different than Claude Code or Cowork, where it's just kind of we're doing everything locally. It's although the inference is happening remotely, more similar to Claude.ai via web, but you need to know that when you're using these AI tools for inference that you're using internally, that you have access to all of that data and you can store it within your lakehouse so that you can own that information that's rightfully yours. I do think it's going to be interesting to see how Slack ultimately responds, because like Salesforce is going to come out with their overall like their agent strategy around it. They know that they have a huge leg up when it comes to like they actually own Slack. You're not supposed to be able to like train data on Slack data. Like there's certain terms of service that they have against that. And so as there's more and more integration from Frontier Labs into Slack, is that going to be something that's more of a walled garden where they start kind of like pushing back on the ability for some of these labs to be able to integrate their own Slack bots where they want to like own that? Kind of similar to what AlphaSense does with owning the super agents. And they really want that to be like their, not necessarily walled garden, but their environment. Like, hey, we built this. We want to be able to get as much value out of this. We don't want as much leakage of the value or value extraction from third parties. Is Slack going to ultimately do the same thing?
My hunch is the answer is no. Like from what I've read and listened to in terms of what Mark Benioff says about AI and how he thinks about it, like I think of all of the like legendary mega founders, he has the most thoughtful pulse on AI for SaaS. And that makes a lot of sense because he's like the SaaS king.
Yeah.
But I think that his approach is very holistic, thoughtful, realistic. I can't imagine a world where he makes it difficult for people to connect his products to these frontier labs because I think he's embracing the fact that that's where things are headed. What Salesforce is really well positioned to do is making that information as well structured as possible so that it's context that provides the most value to the inference process.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's my hunch.
But what happens if like, your entire firm has a Claude bot in every session? It then reads every session that you have, and then Claude launches oh, by the way, we have a Slack clone directly into Claude. Feel free to just use this because we have all of your message history as well, and we've re-implemented your version of Slack with even more capabilities in Claude because each one of these sessions now inherently is just a Claude co-work session that you could kind of fork conversations on. So the ability, I think, to be able to clone and replicate data.
But that's kind of like this conversation of like, oh, I can use Claude to recreate whatever SaaS subscription I'm paying $50 a month for. It's like, yes, you can. But one, is that worth your time? Depends on what you're doing with your life. Two is these SaaS products don't just finish. Like there is no completion to Slack. They're pumping out new features every day. Like they're new. Have you ever checked like the Today tab?
We just upgraded to Enterprise.
Yeah.
And it looks pretty sweet.
It tells me what to do when I log in the morning. It's like, oh, these are all the messages that you've missed. And I'm like, thank you. I wasn't going to read half of these if you didn't tell me. So it's like, it's things like that. Like, yes, you can go to Claude and recreate Slack, but you're taking a snapshot of what it is today and losing out on everything that it'll become. And I think that applies to all SaaS tools.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them, there's really low risk, right? Like if I wanted to recreate Calendly, I could probably do that with very little risk, right? But some of these Salesforce tools are very complex and they're always changing, you know?
But I think like the biggest thing for Slack is just the UX is good enough and it has a network effect. Everyone's familiar. I'm hooked on Slack. Like I think I look at my battery usage on my phone and Slack is always at the top of the list.
When we upgraded on Monday, there was like a 24-hour period where I wasn't getting notifications and I didn't know. Like worst 24 hours of my life.
I don't like notifications in Slack, actually. Like I check it so much as it is that I like to know if I'm not looking at it, there's probably something that I should be, but I kind of want to look at it when I need to, just because I'm probably looking at it too much.
I like having the notifications on my phone, so I'll have my phone on my desk and I can at least see when people are messaging me, but that wasn't working either. So it was just like...
I noticed that. I mean, yeah, I'm sure you noticed that I noticed it. I was like, messaging is like 6 o'clock. It's okay, you're going to get back to this email thread, 8 o'clock. You're going to get back?
And I saw it at 6 o'clock the next morning and I was like, I didn't get any of these messages.
Yeah. And then a big thumbs up emoji. What else is new? What else is going on in the world of AI, finance, asset management, hedge funds?
So we talked about the frontier models. You've got some really interesting, we were talking about some interesting things on the hyperscaler side.
Yeah.
Walk me through those.
Sure. So I always like a little bit more of the techie side of AI deployments, not actually on the frontier models, but more of like the tooling around it. This week, AWS came out with micro VMs through the Lambdas team, which I think is a great interface for running agents. I think most people a year ago, when they started using the Claude Code SDK or Open Code, they would say like, oh, I want to run this on the cloud as a natural next step to running it on your machine. And the first place that most people think of for running an agent on the cloud is a Lambda. Now, obviously, like, there's Azure Functions and there's Google has Google Functions, but like most people think of serverless compute and Lambda as synonymous. It's almost like the Kleenex of compute. And so when you would try to run the agent SDK in Lambdas, it just didn't really work very well. There was a cold start problem. It didn't allow for the general loop. AWS did come out with Agent Core, which is like an opinionated agent harness, looks kind of like Lambdas, works with certain agent harness frameworks. Originally came out with it was supporting LangGraph, and I think now I'm not sure if it supports Claude Code. It's been nice, but it's like an opinionated compute and harness combination. Whereas with the micro VMs, it really is just like serverless compute as a Lambda. Exactly what you think it would be. Fly.io has had this for a little bit, but having AWS offer micro VMs via Lambdas for agents, as simple as that. Running, I think it's using Firecracker. A lot of the other like frontier labs, when they're running compute for agents, are also using Firecracker. It's like a more locked down version of Docker that gives kernel level isolation. So it's like if you're running ephemeral compute that looks like a VM, like Firecracker is kind of like the most secure way to do it. And that's what AWS has rolled out through micro VM. So excited to see that. What else is going on? There is, GKE. So it's Google's Kubernetes engine rolled out native support for agents through a similar concept like agent runtimes so you could within GKE, which is where you host, for people that aren't familiar, it's where you host a lot of your infrastructure in managed compute, where you don't have like a native service that's like that's running. Like you can host a Postgres database as like managed Postgres, where it's a service that AWS might provide out of the box, or Microsoft Azure provides out of the box. Instead, you might want to run your own kind of like Kubernetes cluster, which is just general compute that's like you managing your own cloud within a cloud. And then within there, you might host your Postgres database. It gives you more control, gives you more kind of scalability. It's heavier weight, so there's more of a burden from an administrative and an infrastructure perspective, but a lot more flexibility. One of the challenges that you have when you're running Kubernetes services are cold start problems. So if you want to spin up equivalent of a micro VM that AWS released in Lambdas, it takes a little bit of time, and like it sometimes can take a while to get that compute. And so from the UX perspective, if I'm running an agent and I'm like typing in, I want it to kind of happen in like real time. I was like, hey, can you go in, check what the most recent management report was for a given name, and then needs to go spin up compute. You might be waiting, and then it starts. Ideally, you'd see like waiting starts like the sub 200 milliseconds. And so anyway, so that's what is now like natively supported within GKE, within Google. So like they have the fastest agent compute available with any of the 3 major hyperscalers Kubernetes services rolled out this week. So for me, that I love really scalable compute frameworks and runtimes for agent harnesses, it's really cool to see both hyperscalers in the same week, making that more accessible. Because up until now, like you kind of had to hack it together if you wanted to use your Azure, Google, or AWS infrastructure for managing large scale agent rollouts, or you had to use some of like the newer kind of neo clouds that, for example, Modal would offer really good agent runtimes, or Fly.io is like a newer like a compute runtime, but they're not like your rubber stamped big 3. So it's kind of cool to see the big 3 in the same week coming out with similar frameworks. And that was exciting for me. I don't know if that resonates with everyone else.
No, I think it does. I mean, even if you don't know how to run these agents yourself, like if you're a company that's using one of these kind of rubber mark stamped good hyperscalers, it now opens the door for you to start scaling agents across your company in a more thoughtful way without necessarily having to take on the risk of using one of these newer neo clouds. And all of the conversations that we've just been having around agents and agent runtimes is a perfect kind of segue into our main topic for the episode, which is agentic loops. So let's just take a quick break and come back and dive into that. Something that I hear pretty consistently from executive leaders in the space is that they see value in AI, but there's no clear path to actually adopting it. Most providers, whether it's the frontier models like Claude and OpenAI, or the platforms being built on top of them, they hand you a product and they leave you to figure out whether it works for your workflows and how. And at Hedgineer, we take a very different approach.
And we're able to because we have industry experience to not just understand investment process in the abstract, but to know how a fund actually operates, where information is sourced, how it moves through a team, what synthesis happens before a decision gets made. Once we understand that, we can build custom connectors in a data platform that connects all your data directly into Claude or OpenAI. Bloomberg, your primes, your internal models, your internal research notes, whatever you're actually using.
And then we deploy our platform on top of that. Think of it as a command center that sits on top of your Claude or OpenAI account. You can see every agent at your disposal, both the personal ones that you've built for yourself, as well as the org-wide ones that are maintained by your company. You can ask them to do things on demand directly within the application, or you could schedule reoccurring tasks that have them running in the background and having them send you the results straight to you via Slack or email.
And we also track usage at the firm over time, so leadership can see where AI is working, where it isn't, and surface opportunities to go deeper.
And we run training sessions with your team on Claude, on the platform, and even how to prompt and build skills better. So the competency builds internally and it sticks over time.
So if you're interested in learning more about how we can help your fund become AI native, shoot us an email at info@hedgineer.io.
So what is a loop?
So really there's two types of loops. There's the loop that you use in an agent harness, like Claude Code or Open Code or Codex. And then there is the concept of looping, which Anthropic rolled out as a feature within Claude Code within the last month or so.
Okay, let's start with the first one.
So the first one is what the agent harness uses in order to execute work for you. So you have a prompt that you pass into an agent harness. An example of an agent harness is Claude Code or Pi Open Code. And then the agent harness has a set of tools that it can call out to. And it also has the ability to call out to a language model and construct a system prompt for that language model to tell it what to do next. So an example will be, I could go to Claude Code and ask what files are in my current directory. It will then take my prompt within the harness. It'll add it to the system prompt where that'll make it say something like, you are a coding agent that is helping a user accomplish a task. You have access to list out the file systems. Let's say you have access to Bash, which can execute ls command to show you what files exist. It can run any other Bash commands, etc. Use this tool in order to help solve the problem. And that's it. And then it will append on what the user typed in, what files are my current file system. And it also include information like if you're done solving the problem, just go back to the user and tell them the result or ask them a question. And so you pass that to language model. Language model then says, oh, okay, I realize what the user's asking. I have a tool called Bash. I think you should execute ls. And so it sends back to the harness, execute this command ls. ls is short for list. The agent harness then gets that. It executes that command locally. The computer, that's his normal command, it knows what to do. It sends back like, oh, there is a test file, a Word doc, and an Excel file. It takes that, it appends it back onto that initial prompt. So the next time the language model gets it, it says like, oh, you're a coding agent helping a user trying to solve a problem. You have access to a Bash command. They asked for what files are in my current directory. You previously were asked this question, and this is the results. You can either make another tool call or go and ask the user a question. It's like, oh, well, now I actually know what the answer is. So then you can print out, just tell the user there's currently an Excel file, a Word document, et cetera, within your system. And so that's kind of like the magic of the agent loop.
I like the fact that you use that example because I think a lot of people think of agentic loops as this new concept that they need to learn and figure out. But the reality is that if you're in Cowork and you ask Claude to find a file or find any information within a folder, or you're using Claude Code to write something, like those are all agentic loops. Like if you've ever taken like an intro to computer science class, there are these primitive types of like loops, right? Like a while loop of like,
Yes.
keep doing this thing until this condition is met. That's literally all agentic loops really are.
Yeah, exactly. That's all it is. And then on top of that very simple concept, you build these beautiful things. Everything that you do within Claude Code, it runs this agentic loop. Everything you do in Cowork, it's this agentic loop. You give it tools, you give the model context around what tools it has access to, and then you almost let the model do the driving. I like to think of the harness as a way to harness the power of the sun, where like if you look at the sun, it's really powerful. There's light going everywhere. But if you wanted to use it to, let's say, cut a silicon wafer with strong precision, you need a way to harness that light and control it in a very specific way to be able to then create a laser that's concentrated to solve a very specific problem. Now, like the power of inference in a language model, it could go anywhere. It just predicts next tokens very effectively. But if you can focus it and give it more of a controlled, discrete set of options that it can use, you take the power of the sun and you really focus it onto a very specific problem. And so that is the agent harness. The concept of an agent loop is that you allow that to like iterate on itself to be able to solve its own problems. And so again, that's the first concept of a loop. The second concept of looping is basically building another loop on top of that, where you will say something, where you give an agent that's using an agent loop a goal, and then you tell it to basically retry every, let's say, 5 minutes. And so what Claude rolled down is they gave you like the loop command. You can say like /loop. It'll take that prompt that you've given it in the context of the agent. You can include skills, MCP servers, and then put it on a schedule. Say like, hey, run this every 5 minutes. So common ways that you use loops are go and look if there's a new PR that anyone's made within our repo and go and run a review on it. Or run a loop, see if anyone's created a new ticket for me to do a task within like a Jira ticket, and then pull it down and go and do that work. Or go and see if there is a new email from a potential client. And so you can do all of that with Claude Code with looping. And it creates like a cron job, runs locally. You can then list out all of the different agent loops that are happening. Each one of them has an explicit goal. And so now it's essentially just a loop on a loop. So the first thing that we described, that's the agent loop. And now we want to say like, hey, like do this work until you've achieved a goal, go to sleep, wake back up. And that's a common loop for a developer. But there's a lot of loops that we actually use throughout life or throughout our work that are very similar. And so what we focus on is like, what are the concepts of loops for research workflows? And so I think one of the best examples of using loops in a research workflow is for an earnings-driven research process.
Yeah, super timely too.
I know, right? So let's look at an example loop that you might want to do for an earnings recap. So an example then might be run every, let's say, hour, see if a new name in your coverage has reported earnings. And if it has, then run the earnings recap skill, look at our notes on earnings, pull down transcripts, look at what our estimates were, pull down consensus, read management transcripts, again, via the transcripts, and produce a template in our standard marketing documents or our standard branding documents of how we could compare what the analyst put in within their estimates, relative consensus, what actually happened, what the analyst's notes were coming out of the meeting, and then what the management team actually reported on to be able to do a full synopsis automatically for you. And so what you have to do without a loop or without an agent is go and manually, at least you can have those skills defined, you could have those MCP servers defined. And then you could go into your Cowork session and say, okay, If, for example, Micron just reported, go run the earnings recap, and it'll go and do that. But what the loop does is it says, okay, you shouldn't have to type that. It should just automatically happen whenever a name reports and pull down that information for you. And you kind of just set it and forget it. And so then you might say, like, okay, well, let's not run that for Micron. Let's run that for every name in the coverage. And so then you might have either one agent loop per name, or you could just have one generic loop that'll spawn a sub-agent for each one of those names in your coverage. And so that's a similar scenario where you take the concept of looping, which was originally created more for developers, and then you take it into a non-engineering research process at a certain stage within a pipeline. Now, there's certain things that you need in order to get that to scale. One of them is you need a concept of the state of a company or the state of a ticker within your research workflow that's managed outside of the agent loop. So you want to know, like, once the company's reported and you've done the earnings recap, the next time that agent wakes up, it's not going to say, like, oh, I need to do the earnings recap again and again and again, and you just burn through tokens. So you need a way to manage state. Many different ways to be able to do that. Like, we have our own research framework that will handle that in. Many third-party RMS systems already have this. So if you're already using an RMS system, like Verity, for example, you could run an agent loop on the APIs available for Verity so that whenever there's an event that you want the agent to execute on, it can go pull down data. It doesn't have to all exist within Verity. But then at the end of that, go and update the status of Verity's, let's say, Q3 2026 fiscal year earnings recap summary to done opposed to an NA. So you need of an RMS or a CRM that manages state. So that's number one. Two, you don't want this to run on your machine. So you need to be able to offload this to a cloud somewhere that has access to the same data, but like you don't want to be dependent on having your laptop open in order for this to execute. Nothing in like a non-AI world works that way. So nothing in a AI world should work that way either, which is kind of what I was touching on in the first half of the episode where we were talking about Lambdas with micro VMs and GKE natively supporting AI agents, that you need that ephemeral compute to run that loop within this concept of looping in an easy way that you don't have to build it. And so like 2 years ago, you kind of had to build some of this yourself. You kind of had to hack it together. Now it's natively supported, and you could use both those. Or you could rely on the Claude managed agents, CMA, as a framework to do that. Cursor has their own Cursor agents framework. OpenAI has their like managed runtime for agent harnesses. You can do the same thing with Agent Core. There's plenty of different options. But like the main thing that I'm getting at when we're talking about looping is that don't shut your computer and your agents just stop. That doesn't make sense. So you need the remote compute. And then the third part is you need all of that context stored and managed somewhere to be able to do that work. So that's both access to the data that agent might need. So it needs to pull down, one needs access to Verity. So either like Verity has an API that you wrap in MCP, or you could have the agent be able to go and hit the API directly. It's easier oftentimes from MCP because what you can do with MCP is put hooks natively in it, which are very helpful for writing. And so you could put a pre-tool hook on an MCP call if you're going to go and update the status, that you can do a lot of like checks ahead of time. And so using some of the native functionality of hooks when you're writing back to something is just nice to use an MCP for. But like you need that for whatever your CRM. It doesn't have to be Verity. All these different tools are capable. All these different CRMs, research management platforms, are capable of it. But then you also need access to transcripts. Or do have some really good analysis around transcripts, or at least you were doing some research on that. I'd love to actually touch on that in a second. But you need maybe like what were consensus estimates going into the print. So like, how do you pull that from Visible Alpha? You want to be able to pull in like, what was your research for either right after the print when you're on the management call and you're taking notes? Maybe you're doing that in Evernote. Maybe you're doing Obsidian. Maybe you're doing it within OneNote or your own SharePoint. You need to be able to pull that down within that agentic loop. You want to be able to potentially pull out like what is market sentiment as well. So you need to have within that agent harness all of that context, but then you also need your skills. Like what does actually a good management analysis look like from a print? Are there any specific nuances of the subsector that we're in? What are the ways in which we want to be able to tie all this together? That's described oftentimes within a skill. You don't need that defined as the agent MD. That's like a reusable asset that's relevant outside of just this one task. And then you might want some memory around like certain ways in which management team refers to context, feedback you've given it before. You can store that in a knowledge store. So that context needs to be mounted onto the agent harness within that runtime when it's running on a loop. And so when you get all those three things together, you have the state management of that name in the workflow, you have the remote cloud compute with the agent harness, and you have the context bolted on. Now you can allow that to just automatically run whenever a name comes out of earnings. And then you might do the same. Let's just take that as a fractal. Let's put that into a pre-earnings workflow. So what do you think going into a print? Then we could do, what do you think when you just first create this concept of new coverage initiation? How do you set up your model? How do you do like a way that you think about the name when you're first starting to think through it, and then store that within a research framework? How do you then want to always do a pre-earnings season comp analysis of all the different names that are like within a relative competitive set? How are they stack ranking within each other? And do that for an entire industry and subsector, and just follow that life cycle and have those, each one of those has an agent on a loop that's waiting for some state or event to be triggered in order to go and do work that has those three things. It has the state management, it has the agentic loop with cloud compute, and it has the right context in order to do the work. And then it starts kind of running a little bit on autopilot. So then you have that for one name in your coverage in a horizontal that's following this earnings-driven workflow. And now let's replicate it for a new name and a new name and a new name and a new name. So now you might have normal analysts have, let's say, some of your pod models, like they might have between 2 and 60 different names in your coverage, oftentimes or 20 and 60 different names in your coverage. Let's go right down the middle. And let's say you have 40 names in your coverage. Well, you just follow that workflow and you reprint all of those agents within those looping frameworks. And now you've basically have a lot of the agentic systems built for an earnings-driven workflow. But what's kind of, at least what I find interesting, is that like that sounded impressive or cool maybe like 2 years ago. Now it's like, oh, it's kind of just obvious. Like that's not necessarily child's play, but like that is kind of like the basics. Because then there's so much more that you want to do beyond just the research workflow, right? Like now you have to say, how are you thinking about positioning? How are you thinking about risk? How are you thinking about crowding and short interest and all these other components that go into building a portfolio? And how do you think about like the treasury management component? How do you think about like suggesting portfolio based off of all of this research that you have? And it's also pulling from your notes and then constructing like, oh, by the way, this might be a more optimal portfolio given your research where you're most bullish and bearish relative to the street. And this portfolio better represents the research of your like team and agents than what you currently have. And then so like that, you might want to like submit that new basket into the portfolio. And then there's the whole post-trade monitoring, right? So we're just talking about the pre-trade workflow, but like there's also like, let's actually look what's in the book right now and make sure the research that we have is always being reflected within the book. And so if you're ever like long a name and suddenly the research that you have within the system is starting to be bearish, you want to make sure that like that's being highlighted as well. And so you have the same types of loops also running from a portfolio monitoring perspective. You have the same type of loops happening in a post-trade workflow. Another common example is, let's say a new trade was made on a instrument that hasn't been properly tagged up front. And like tags can mean a million different things. Sometimes you have to tag an instrument to a subsector or a specific classification or a deal or a strategy that aligns what the research team's doing to how IR reports on it. And you might see a new instrument show up in the portfolio that doesn't have any of these tags, either in your portfolio management system or your RMS system. And a user needs to get alerted to go and add the tag. This is this is the same thing for an agentic loop. Wait every day, every 10 minutes, go and see if there's any trade in the portfolio that's has a position on an instrument without a tag, and go and research the name, given these 4 different tools, and suggest what tag you think it should be, and then send an email to a user asking for approval based off of your research, the name of the portfolio, and what the tag should be, and allow them to be able to provide back a yes or no to be able to then have the agent go back and update the tag. So that's an example. If you do that over MCP, like the tag update, that you put a hook on it so that it doesn't have an auto approval to call the MCP tool to write, but it gets a user approval. And that a user approval could happen within a Claude tag that we talked about earlier within Slack, or it could happen over email. But that's an example of going back to looping, because all that is just an agent with a goal and an objective, access to tools, running in the cloud, managing state, and being able to go and execute. And then that's all an agent is ultimately. So I think one of the things we're also talking on, so once we kind of get into looping, what's the difference between an agent, a skill, an agent harness, context and MCP? And I think like the concept of a loop starts kind of like tying a lot of those things together. Whereas, yeah.
I think from an implementation perspective, yes, you're right in that it's basic, but like one thing that I could not stress enough is how important the context is and how difficult it is to get right. It's almost like an art, because there is definitely someone that's listening to this right now that has been like, oh, I tried to automate my earnings preview or my earnings recap note, and the output was shit and I didn't like it. And I tried to write a really good prompt and I put all of the things that I needed from it, and it had all the data connectors, and it just failed. And what I would respond to that is, when you are delegating out work to even humans, the more hands-off you become, the more context is important. Like if you were to go to, let's say, a junior analyst that just joined your team, right? And you had them put together a recap, and you were like, every single time you write a new paragraph, come back to me. I'm going to review it. I'm going to write it up. You're going to rewrite it. And I'm going to micromanage you through this. The intelligence of that analyst stops mattering at a certain point because you're really holding their hand through every single piece. And that's akin to how people have been using AI historically, right? You go to Claude, you write a prompt to have it do the first piece of your task, you see the output, then you give it a new prompt to do the next thing, and you kind of hold its hand. Whereas now you're essentially going to a new analyst and saying, hey, this is what a good recap looks like. Figure it out. And at that point, the intelligence of that analyst, and in the case of the AI, the context of what good looks like and how you get there is what determines whether or not this loop makes or breaks whatever workflow you're integrating it into.
100%. In owning that context and feeling a sense of responsibility for its constant improvement is a core competency of any firm that's really using AI, which is one of the risks that you start losing a little bit if you start relying on a single frontier lab for doing essentially, relying on anyone really for doing everything for you, from context management to harness and infrastructure to inference, all within a single vertical, because then they start knowing more about you than you even have the capability of knowing about yourself. Because it's one thing, like, you have to be a little bit loose in not having to know how all of it works and every single step along the way, that you could do this on your own, or you could re-implement your own Slack bot. That's not the goal, but knowing at least if you have the data and the context available to you and you can fix those things, you can change them and you can point them somewhere else, like, that is what's critical. And the way that you touch on, I mean, it really resonates with me. Like, you need to feel as though you, if you needed to, could control this and move it to somewhere else. And if you feel as though you've lost that control, I think that's a huge risk.
Yeah. And I feel like I talk to people at our clients and also just outside in the world where they're using Claude, they're using Cowork, they're maybe even using code, and they're not using skills at all. They're not really saving their context. They're not thinking about context management. They're just writing these really elaborate system prompts that they're copying and pasting every single time. And they're like, yeah, AI works great for me. I think that if you're actually serious about using an agentic loop, I would say that you have to write skills. Like, you need to have some level of predetermined thought on how you're organizing the information that your agent needs in order to loop. Otherwise, you're just going to keep burning through tokens. You're going to keep getting terrible outputs, and you're going to get more and more frustrated with this over time.
Yeah. And if you're administrator or somebody that's responsible for the deployment of AI within your organization, you need to make sure that you're capturing all of that for each one of your users at an enterprise level, Because otherwise you're going to have people that run into silos. They build silos on their own, and maybe they are very successful to a certain point, but the complexity that they build and your visibility into that complexity is something that starts to create a bigger risk on the organization. And so there's a second element of like, if you're an individual user, you have to be creating skills. If you're an administrator that's responsible for the deployment of AI within your organization where people are being or creating skills, you have to be able to observe and make sure that you're capturing all of that data on the behalf of the longevity of the organization.
Yeah, especially when you start seeing these compute costs go up, where you as an administrator of your kind of Claude or OpenAI subscription, you only really see how much people are spending, and you don't actually understand the ROI of that spend. And so I think having an insight into what these loops are doing, what they're actually producing, what skills they're using, like all of that is a key determiner in figuring out whether or not you're wasting money or actually improving your overall return.
Yeah. And unless you have AI analyzing that usage of AI for you, just being able to see a cost breakdown of token spend per person is a horrible KPI in being able to make any sophisticated determination of how you're actually using AI within the organization, which is shocking to me of how many people, when they go, oh, I have like usage analytics, and they just show me total number of tokens used per person, and then like breaking it down by model. Because like how can you make any sort of decision based off of that? Like you actually have to go into like, if there's a session where somebody spent $100 on it, what did they do? Like, oh, well, they actually made 4 different PRs that are all tied to a very high ROI initiative. Oh, that's great. Yes, that was $100 well spent. Whereas somebody else spent $100 on a token, it could have been the same person, and they were just burning through tokens trying to solve a problem that had no relevance for the business, or was just pure experimentation, which or when they could have used an easier model or a lower spend model. So by just looking at token spend per person, or token spend per model, or even token spend per like tool, you get very little visibility into, is there actually value there? But once you're able to analyze those sessions and understand in depth, you're able to really influence behaviors, able to make like informed decisions on how to better optimize token spend.
Yeah, it's super rewarding to see how excited our clients get when they see a usage report from us for the first time, because I feel like in a lot of ways, usage tracking was not the thing that we kind of set out to do. Like we were like building agents, building skills, building like data warehouse. We were building like products for people, and usage tracking was an important feature within that. But the first time someone sees, oh, you're breaking down my spend by, this is how much you spent on research, this is how much you spent on portfolio management, this is how much you spent on operations, and this is how successful your tokens were actually yielding returns for your business based on how good the output was. They were like, I didn't even know that this was possible. And it's just like, it's not rocket science. You just have to build it. Yeah. You know, but we didn't do anything incredible. I don't think that we did anything. We weren't inventing a new technology. We were just using the AI that already existed in a somewhat novel way. But like, I feel like the facial expression that people see, that we see in people when they see those reports for the first time, is like kind of great.
Yeah. So I guess with that, Jhanvi, it's been another awesome episode.
Yeah.
Pleasure co-hosting with you.
Yeah, same here.
And thanks for everyone for tuning in. So again, this is the Hedgineer podcast. You can follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. We're on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, pushing out episodes every week. Until next week, I'm your co-host, Michael Watson.
And I'm Jhanvi.
And we will see you soon.
The Hedgineer podcast releases episodes weekly on Tuesday. Our hosts are Michael Watson and Jhanvi. The Hedgineer podcast is produced and edited by Aaron Free. Follow us on your social platform of choice and reach out to us at podcast@hedgineer.io.